All right, so we will dive into those questions. I'm gonna start off individually asking some questions, and I will be passing this mic over to you all to be able to speak into it. I'm gonna start it off with asking my first question to Lee. All of these panels and discussions we've been having in the e-bike realm of like, we need the youth voice. So again, I'm just so grateful. This is such a part of what we're seeing here. So Leaf, my question to you is, can you tell us a little bit why you like riding e-bikes?
All right, cool. So yeah, I like riding e-bikes because they're fun, and the freedom that I get when I get to just ride wherever I want to around my neighborhood, or if I want to go to the park with my friends, just the ability to do that with my friend too. Who, like, if my friend has an e-bike, it's so much more fun to just ride an e-bike with them than have my parents or drive there with them. It's just the differences and the connections you get to make around town is just so much better.
Thank you. Perfect. Good. I'll take that back. Okay, so I'm gonna bounce around a little bit because I know God, we have so many things we can dive into here, and we'll come back to Leaf with some other things. But I'm gonna dive into the legal side of things. Chris, are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. So if you can give us a baseline of e-bike law, what is and is not allowed in the state of Oregon, like in a nutshell. I think we always love to learn a little bit more about what we can and cannot do. So here we come.
Sure. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. And I would say that generally, there's a lot to cover in terms of what you can and can't do while riding an e-bike on the roads and paths in Oregon. And we have some resources on our law firm's website, including an e-bike Know Your Rights book, and that's OregonBikeLaw.com. But I would say generally, in terms of the importance of knowing what the law is, we all know that it's important to know, for one thing, not to get a ticket if you're out riding improperly. Another reason that that's important is that if a collision happens involving a bicyclist and another motor vehicle or another bike, or something happens, a lot of times, if someone violated one of Oregon laws, that's a factor in deciding who's at fault for what happened and who can recover for damages that are caused by the crash. And that's what we a lot of times see in our work as an important thing to consider when deciding who's responsible for causing a crash. Generally speaking, e-bikes are treated very similarly to regular bikes under Oregon law. There's a statute that says that generally e-bikes are treated the same as regular bikes, unless there's specifically something called out in the statute that distinguishes e-bikes. And so if you know what your rights and responsibilities are as a bicyclist, then generally you know most of what your rights and responsibilities are as an e-bike rider. And there are a couple of exceptions. One is, as we know, many of us, there is an age requirement of 16 years old to ride an e-bike. And another one is that there is a prohibition on riding e-bikes on the sidewalk, which is important in some situations to know that. That's sort of in terms of statewide laws. Those are some of the big ones. Another important thing to keep in mind is there's a legal definition of what an e-bike is. And it's important to consider whether the bike that you think is a legal e-bike, in fact, meets the legal definition of an e-bike, which is now capped at a speed of 28 miles an hour. And there are restrictions on the size of the electric motor. But if you're riding a bike that has been modified or sold to be faster than that, then in fact you can be taken out of what's considered a bicycle into what's considered a motorcycle, and all of the licensing and insurance requirements that go along with that. So that's one important thing to consider. But for the most part, bikes that you buy off the rack are going to be legally compliant e-bikes. So you all probably heard about a recent law that was passed in the Oregon legislature around e-bikes, and this was known as Trenton's Law. named after a child who was killed in an e-bike collision recently in Bend. And the law, the original sort of scope of the law was to expand e-bike access so that people under 16 could legally ride certain types of e-bikes, and also to expand educational funding for teaching younger people about e-bikes. And that was modified before its final passage, such that there was a three-class system that was implemented in Oregon. So now, instead of just there being a definition of e-bikes in Oregon, there are class 1, class 2, and class 3 e-bikes. Class 1 e-bikes are pedal-assisted bikes that are capped at 20 miles an hour. Class 2 e-bikes have throttles and are capped at 20. And class 3 are pedal-assisted e-bikes that go up to 28. And the impetus for imposing the class system was to allow people under 16 to be able to ride class 1 e-bikes. That was the original scope of the law, as I understand it. One of the thoughts around that law. And ultimately, that part of the law was not included in the final passage. And so what was passed was the three-class system, which is now, there's a sort of a framework so that going forward, there can be legislation based on certain classes of e-bikes. But right now, I'm not aware of any law in Oregon that says that class 3 e-bikes can do this, but class 1 and 2 e-bikes can't do it in terms of Oregon law. And I understand that there are Sun River, for example, allows class 1 and class 2 e-bikes, but not class 3 e-bikes. But in terms of Oregon rules of the road, what you can do out on the roadway, at this point, all e-bikes are created equal under the law. But now that there are three classes going forward, then conceivably there will be the opportunity to regulate based on classes and potentially allow people under 16 to legally ride some types of e-bikes. So I'll stop there for now unless
yeah, I mean, we'll circle back.
Sure.
There's so much more, right? Excellent. Okay, so we're gonna move down the line because these are all within each of these. There's so much, right? So moving down to Henry, we definitely want to hear what Bend Park and Rec District has for new updates to really their facilities and what they're planning for their e-bike, how to accommodate e-bike on their trails and in their parks. So Henry.
Got it. Thanks, Whitney. And thank you guys so much for coming. We really appreciate it. Just to start off, some of you guys may be wondering why the Park District is involved in this. Well, by our latest count, there's about 120 miles of trails in Bend, and the Park District directly operates and maintains more than 88 miles of those trails. So we're a big kind of player in the trails and transportation world here in the city, and there's a lot of intersection between our facilities and city facilities. So I think we have a larger hand in a lot of the trail development than a lot of people realize here in town. Starting off with this question, I guess more to start with kind of the policy side of things, is that the Park District hasn't made any recent changes to our policies regarding e-bikes. Currently, based on our rules and regulations, an e-bike is allowed anywhere else a bicycle is allowed in our system. So that's on most trails and most paths. There are a few trails that are restricted, Riley Ranch Nature Reserve, and then a couple trails in Shevlin Park, which are restricted to pedestrians only. So no bikes, but no e-bikes. Our executive director does have the right to exclude e-bikes in other areas, kind of based on decree, for lack of a better word. We haven't exercised that right yet. It's interesting. Originally, a lot of our concern with e-bikes was going to be on more of our single track Shevlin Park type trails, but that's really not what we've seen. The most of the conflicts and the most of the reports that we've gotten from the community are more on the paved paths, particularly in the busier areas, along the river, through the Old Mill District and that sort of thing. We may make changes in the future. One of the interesting things with, as Chris was describing with the House Bill 4103 or Trenton's Law, is that it has now created a 3-class system of e-bikes, which for us is a little bit problematic because our original rules and regulations just pointed to the old state definition, which was really much more akin to a class 1 type e-bike. And that was, really part of the conversation prior to my time, but as I understand it, when we were saying, hey, what bikes do we want to allow on our system? So we don't have any plan right now to reopen that, but it's definitely something we're thinking of, especially with these class 3 e-bikes, which, according to our park stewards who do a lot of our enforcement, for lack of a better word, and a lot of the contacts with the public, those have been the largest problems. From a facility standpoint, I'll probably talk more about trail design in the next question, Whitney, but we haven't really made any specific changes to e-bikes per se. We haven't done charging stations. There's no like e-bike specific infrastructure that we've done. We did recently work with Kittleson Associates, which is a local transportation firm, transportation planning firm here, to do a study on parking and bicycle access for our riverfront parks. And one of the interesting things that came up is bicycle parking and the size of a lot of these newer e-bikes, particularly the cargo bikes. A lot of our employees are riding and a lot of people in the public. So we are looking at our development standards and thinking about creating a standard for all new parks and trails that would have more space around a certain number of the bicycle racks. But yeah, no like e-bike specific things, but we are really thinking about this from a trail design perspective. And it's kind of part of the next question. If you want to just do it then.
Yeah.
Are you sure? Because I'll probably talk for a long time.
All right, we'll give Will.
All right, sounds good. Yeah.
Here, pass back, even though I can't project my voice quite far. But I'm actually gonna kind of talk just a little bit, because they just kind of feeding off a little bit of what Henry was talking about. I want to go back to Leaf before I go and shift over to Will. Kind of talking about your experience as a writer, and what are some of, if any, this is for you, Leaf, what are some, if any, barriers you faced writing out, like actual physical barriers you've experienced, or let me think about that you found in the facilities that you've used while writing, and or anywhere you wish you had more information or education on writing safety, like that being a barrier of just knowledge and your experience with that.
So I've pretty much ridden, I've pretty much ridden e-bikes all around town, and definitely some of the barriers that I have encountered are just with the design and where it just becomes something that's not pleasant anymore, such as when I go to school at Caldera, which is all the way across town for me. So I have to go on some harder roads to get there on my e-bike, which just it's more difficult to figure out how I should do that. So I think that could be something that we could talk about, is like how to make this a better place for e-bikes to also be able to go here. And then also just the fact that there's the limitations of an e-bike now with obviously the new bills and everything, just what you can do and what you can't, and where you're supposed to be able to do something and where I'm not able to. I feel like that's just something that we don't ever, or at least for now, we haven't been able to know about. But other than that, it is nice when there aren't any roads or big barriers that would stop you from having a good time on your e-bike. I think that's like the only things.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely, definitely. We all wish for some amazing infrastructure to come into play over time. So well said. Okay, now I'm going to move down the line down to Will, and I want to know what you've observed in e-bike purchasing trends in the past year, style of bikes, classes, age of purchasers, and like really what you've observed in that environment.
Okay, so to start off, I want to clarify, anybody that goes down to Sun River, when I was talking to Chris, I may have made a mistake. You can't have a class 2 down in Sun River. You have to disconnect your throttle. They only allow you to go down there with pedal assist. So not class 3. Just want to clarify. Also want to recognize somebody here today, a very special day for her. Lucy is celebrating 1 day at Commute Options. So Lucy, congratulations. Yeah, so it's been interesting. It's been an interesting journey for me with regards to e-bikes. I used to be Mr. 300 miles a week roadie out there, and probably 2017, 2018, I was with my group of people. The Peloton was on a training ride, and a guy came up on something called an e-bike. Nobody had ever seen one before. And I came up next to him and asked him a couple of questions. He wasn't dressed like a rider. He wasn't very safe on the bike. He really didn't know what he was doing. And I was kind of a jerk because that's what a lot of competitive cyclists are. And I told him that if he caused a problem, I was going to knock him off his bike. However, I was the COO over at Santa Cruz Bicycles. And while I was there, we developed our first e-mountain bike. A lot of people in the mountain bike industry were not for having e-bikes. They wanted the traditional acoustic bikes only. But by the time we got into it, and by the time I did a lot of test riding, I really fell in love with it. There's definitely a purpose and a place for e-bikes, and now I'm a huge advocate. It's been interesting to see what's been happening over the last few years. We've had the trend move from kids only buying the bikes, or their parents buying them so that they can get to school, get to their work without the parents having to get, be late to work, things like that, which was the trend maybe 5 to 7 years ago. But now 80 to 90% of all of our sales are from people that are retired. People that have RVs, they like to travel. As soon as two people buy the bikes, they have their group of friends, suddenly everybody has to have them. They all have to have the same rack and stuff like that. And they love the fact that pretty much anywhere they go, it's the ease of access for e-bikes continues to open up, right? The other thing that is really interesting is the younger crowd really doesn't have a lot of experience with mechanical devices, period end. I mean, everybody knows that a bike is complicated, maybe not as complicated as a car, but it is complicated. Now you throw in electronics and it's doubly so. And you end up with people that really don't understand, these young people don't understand what's going on with all the physics and dynamics associated with this heavier e-bike at higher speeds. And one of the things that we've found is that they've received this new bike, mom and dad bought it for them, they're super happy. They don't want to disappoint by getting in an accident or crashing the bike or, whatever. And because of that, and because they don't really know about the mechanics of the bike, a lot of times brakes will start to fail. The brake pads on these disc bikes, they wear out rather quickly. And what happens is these young people come in and they're kind of shy to tell you what's going on. You test their brakes and they have none. And the first question we ask these kids is, let me see the soles of your shoes. Because every single time they're smooth because they use their feet to stop. They don't have the braking power left on the bike, right? So one of the things that I want to see happen is we see these trends continue with more and more people looking at and using e-bikes is the education piece of it, that you didn't break the bike. It just wore out the normal way it would. And someone that's mature, like somebody, all the people in this room that are a little older, they know about this, but these young kids don't. And so I'm looking forward to, finding out what avenues we can use in order to enhance the education around this particular topic, because it's a huge issue and it's a huge safety issue. And I'm looking forward to being closer to the Commute Options group to do this. So there you go.
All right, I'm just gonna come back to you, actually. Well,
Okay.
I kind of want to stay on that a little bit of just, you started to answer what's the other kind of part of the question. The other question I want to ask you is, there is obviously a need for educating on maintenance. What are the other efforts that you do offer when people do come in to purchase a bike, I guess, of any age, that helps offer a little bit of education on how to safely ride, and also any kind of maintenance?
Sure. So to date, everything we do is in-house. We have trained mechanics. We have actually hosted a couple classes where we go over all the finer points to maintenance your bike. And that's been truly successful. We do have some gaps that we need to recognize and take some time to think a little more deeply about what we could be doing and coordinating with some of the local groups so that we're not doing one-offs to do this kind of thing. But it continues to be something that is organic. We do offer everybody that comes in, we give them a one-on-one class about e-bikes. We do a follow-up. You buy a bike from us, you get a free tune-up. And when they come in, we talk about what's going well for you, what's not going well for you. We've partnered with a group that used to be called CORE. It's now called Rooted Homes. We supply bikes for every new homeowner, and we give them an education when they buy their bike and pick it up. We give them another follow-up education when they do their first tune-up, and then a year later, we do it again. And the reason why is in Bend, unlike where I'm from, Southern California, where you can basically ride 360 days out of the year, there's 5 days of rain down there. Up here, you can't really ride too much when it's cold and snowy and stuff like that. And people in the springtime, they come in and they're like, I can't remember how to turn my bike on, or I can't remember how to charge it, or, whatever the question is. So having that, not only the first education, but the follow-up education is super important. Yep.
Passing the torch. We're gonna bring it back to law. Are you ready, Chris? Thomas Kuhn, Newton, and Frost has represented hundreds of bicyclists in Oregon in personal injury cases. So what are the most common cases related to e-bikes that you have seen in your work?
Yeah, so we, as lawyers who represent people who have been injured in bicycle collisions, see some patterns in the types of collisions that cause injuries to our clients. And I think that if we were to aggregate all the data over, the many years of doing this, the overwhelming majority of our cases come from clear liability. Generally, driver turns across bike lane and fails to look or yield the right of way as they're required to by law. And there have been studies of the percentage of drivers who fail to look for cyclists in the bike lane before turning across them as they're required to. And it's, I think, a majority of drivers who are not properly yielding the right of way in those situations. And I think it's borne out in data from our cases and from some studies that have been done by a Portland-based group called Bike Loud that's studied police reports across the city of Portland for causes of collisions. And so that's with respect to bicyclists sort of more generally. I would say that that's also the case with respect to e-bikes. I think we have seen a couple of cases where, e-bikes have been involved in collisions or in incidents that had some element of speed, some component of speed involved. I think one case we had or looked at was involving someone who rode an e-bike who wasn't an experienced cyclist, who rode an e-bike on a steep hilly area and was not accustomed to descending those types of hills on a bike because they hadn't been able to ride those kinds of hills on a bike before. And so they hadn't developed the kind of descending skills that you do if you're a cyclist. And their lack of familiarity with descending at higher speed on hills was a factor in causing them to crash. But I would say the overwhelming majority of cases that we see involving e-bikes are relatively clear liability collisions involving collisions with cars where the driver failed to look or see the person riding. And that's just unfortunately a very common theme in our work.
Yeah. Why don't you hold on to that?
Sure.
And I think from there, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I want to let you dive into a little bit of that discussion to tell us a little bit about insurance, e-bikes, and what you're seeing and the kind of challenges with translating how that might apply.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you know, e-bikes occupy an interesting area between bicycles and motor vehicles. They're obviously they have a motor on them, but like I said earlier, under the law, for the most part, they're treated like bicycles. But if you are to take a close look at insurance policies, auto insurance policies, and homeowners insurance policies, you will find that there are sometimes exclusions for motor vehicles in terms of coverage that you're entitled to. So anyone who's riding their bike or walking in Oregon who is in a collision with a car, if that car is uninsured or doesn't have enough insurance, then even though your car is at home in your driveway, you as a bicyclist or a pedestrian can make a claim against your own auto insurance, which is a really helpful and important coverage. And there are arguments that bicyclists or e-bikes fall within an exclusion of coverage for motor vehicles that are not listed on the policy. I have never seen an insurance company assert that argument and really go to the mat over it. And I would be hopeful that they would lose if they tried to, because I think there are strong arguments that there should be coverage. But there's at least enough ambiguity there that people who are really concerned about that might go out and actually get a special endorsement for their e-bike. I don't do that, but you know, people who are concerned about it enough could do that. Another area there's some risk is that if you are on an e-bike and you are on a multi-use path, let's say, and you collide with another bicyclist or a pedestrian, there's no car involved in that collision, and so auto insurance doesn't apply. And if they wanted to, the person who got hurt in that collision could sue the e-bike rider. And some homeowners insurance policies, which is the policy that would apply there, have exclusions for injuries caused by motor vehicles. And so that's another issue that could arise. I think collisions between e-bikes and other bikes or pedestrians, in our experience, are the small minority compared to collisions involving motor vehicles, but they do happen. And if they do, then there's some concern about whether there's liability insurance coverage through homeowners policies.
So much in there, right? Okay, that's, I'm gonna just keep using my blood shelter. All right, I'm gonna go back to Henry now. You get to talk about some of the challenges of increased e-bike activity and what Ben Park and Rec is pursuing for some solutions.
It's good, thanks, y'all. So the biggest challenge I think that we're seeing on our trail system are the increased sustained speeds coupled with that e-bikes really have, right? You know, it used to be somewhat difficult to pedal up to 20 miles an hour and hold that speed. Now with the push of a button or with pedal assist, we can see people holding those sustained speeds quite a bit more. We're also seeing that coupled with a really sharp increase over the last 5 years in outdoor recreation and trail use in particular. You know, we've got a system of trail counters throughout our district, and no surprise with the pandemic, you know, all forms of outdoor recreation shot up. We've seen a little bit of a settle down since the end of the pandemic, but we're still seeing really high numbers, and we don't see that changing anytime soon, especially in a town that's so kind of outdoor and fitness oriented like that. So in terms of the solutions, you know, I just going to touch on this briefly, but I think education and enforcement are important. I know much less about that. It's not my specialty, but I will say in talking to trail users, it doesn't seem like there's a really good culture of etiquette. And this is how you responsibly ride a bike. This is how you pass safely. And people will say, well, I'm riding safe for me, or I'm riding at a safe speed for me, but you really need to think about other people. And so I usually tell people, ride at a speed that you think is safe for the people around you, not yourself. You know, me personally, I'm kind of a designer and a planner. I'm much more focused on how we can try to change that user behavior through design. And I think design can be part of the problem and is part of the problem, but it also can be a big part of the solution in changing behavior on trails. You know, since I've been with the Park District, I've really worked really hard to try to promote good trail design, ensure that we're designing our facilities according to existing and emerging best practices. And I'm just going to maybe touch on some of the different elements that we're starting to think about or have been thinking about trail design. So this, more kind of focused on multi-use trails, but all multi-use trails are designed for a particular design speed. In the Park District and a lot of other agencies, we use 18 miles an hour as our design speed. And so what that does is it dictates how sharp of curves you can have. It dictates your sight distances, your sight lines at intersections. 18 miles per hour for a long time has been the recommended design guideline by state and federal agencies. I would not be surprised if we see that change. We've already, tried to exceed that on some of our new multi-use trails, but it can get tricky in certain situations. It really limits you on how sharp you can turn and how much you have to clear at an intersection, which we don't always control the property in intersections. It can get really complicated. Speaking of intersections, I would say, anecdotally, we know that a lot of the serious conflicts between bikes and vehicles happens at crossings and happens at intersection points. So we have been hyper-focused on trying to upgrade our intersections to meet modern standards. A great example of that is the Hall Road Trail. We had a federal grant for a couple $1 million a number of years ago, and we repaved the entire Hall Road Trail and converted a portion of that trail from aggregate to asphalt. When we did that, we designed all the intersections to adhere to what are called the AASHTO trail design or bicycle facilities design standards. That is something on all new trails that we want to keep doing. There's kind of case by case situations where sometimes we'll change from those a little bit, but some of the design interventions that we've done, we've added a center line stripe for 75 feet as you approach an intersection. We've also added crossing ahead signage, and we also added signage along Century and along a lot of those roads that intersect with Century to warn vehicular users that, hey, when you're turning, you are required to stop or yield for trail users and to look out for trail users. A lot of people ask about width of our trails. The average width of a multi-use path has increased over the years. A number of years ago, it was 8 feet recommended. Now the city and the Park District, our minimum is 10 for, well, I don't want to say that. For our primary multi-use trails, we strive for 10 feet. But you're seeing trails that are wider in a lot of locations. I don't think that's the only solution, but definitely width can have an impact on your ability to pass safely. And, I always think about the mom or the dad with the twin stroller and a bicyclist coming by, and it is amazing how much space that takes up. If you add that to a bicyclist and their handlebars, that can be 10 feet right there with just a little bit of passing space. In terms of changes to our designs, we have been starting to look at, okay, how do we update our development standards and our design standards to try to encourage better behavior that I was talking about. So we've been working with the Old Mill District over the last couple of months to create some new striping plans for the trails through the Old Mill District. It's kind of an interesting area because we have an easement there, but the Old Mill District actually maintains the trail and does all the maintenance on the trail through there, not the Park District, but we work in tandem with them. So we're going to be adding some centerline striping around sharp curves. It's going to be a dash 4-inch yellow centerline. And then through the underpasses, there'll be a solid yellow center line like you see on the Hall Road Trail approaching the intersections. And those are to do two things: to encourage people to stay to the right, to pass safely. And then where there's the solid yellow line, it's very similar to markings that you would see on a road and are pretty universally understood to discourage passing in those situations where it may not be as safe. There's other things we're starting to look at, particularly thinking about people commuting at high rates of speed, low light conditions. We're really discouraging the use of bollards for traffic control on our trails. There was a recent case in California where a young business owner was on a group ride and hit a bollard and died, actually. And so you're seeing in the trail industry a lot of the pullback from that, really looking at physical obstructions, adding warning, striping, other things like that on the trails to really try to do that, and then just circling all the way back, education, and enforcement. As a park district, we don't have any citation powers. We can exclude people from our trails, but our park stewards describe it as a game of whack-a-mole. They'll exclude, one person, they're back the next day. And our only recourse then is to call the police, who I think admittedly have better priorities. So education, some sort of enforcement, I think, on top of all the design stuff would be really, really important.
take the mic back just to give that plug for education, just to highlight the importance of, yes, hurrah for education. I mean, in community options, we educate the elementary and middle schoolers about how to safely ride on the road, and that translates to riding on an e-bike. So we are definitely cheers for that and want to see that grow. So I kind of want to open that same type of question up to the panel. If anybody else has any other thoughts on what they're seeing as some of the greatest challenges might apply specifically to Bend or specifically to e-bike riding out there, what those challenges are, and other ideas on solutions that they might have brewing or dreams of solutions that they might have, if anybody has any additional comments to add. Anybody? Yeah.
So most of you probably know that there's a new rule that says that you can't ride your e-bike to school. Even if you're 16, you can't ride your e-bike to school. So we've had a lot of kids coming in recently to get their bike tuned up. And I asked them about that rule and what do they think about it? And they said, we just park across the street. So they find ways around the rules, right? So kids are naturally inquisitive. They want to get out there and have fun with their friends. And as soon as you say, no, you can't do this, then they're like, okay, fine, I'll figure out a way to go around it. So if we could, and I've talked to you about this a little bit, Whitney, but if we could continue to work on not just the education piece, but better solutions that would help educate and monitor those folks, just like getting a driver's permit. You have to go through education to learn how to drive a car before you start driving the car. When you want to go fishing, you have to have a fishing license that says you know about the rules. We can do something similar to that, how to ride an e-bike, how to pass people safely on the road or on a sidewalk, whatever. The more that we can do that and bring the younger people into the fold instead of trying to exclude them and saying, no, you just can't do, because they're going to try to circumvent that. The more we can do in that arena, I think the better off we're going to be as a community.
Do you have anything else? Anybody else?
Yeah, I would just say, my oldest kid is a 9-year-old. I know that in a few years, he's gonna be wanting to ride his bike everywhere. We live in a relatively dense area of Portland where it's pretty easy to ride a conventional bike as a person and get around. But I know a lot of places with hills and more spread out facilities are much more accessible for people riding e-bikes. And I think that the explosion really of kids' interest in riding e-bikes and being independent from their parents is really a sign of a potentially great thing in terms of them having independence, the ability to get around in places that are, not all that easy to walk around in, but you can get around on an e-bike. So I think it's really neat to see. I know there are some growing pains, including worn out tread on sneakers, and I hope that the solution is to get more kids on e-bikes and teach them the rules and the maintenance and how to ride responsibly, rather than putting more obstacles in their way to potentially try to contain that, because as you identified, there's so much momentum here that it's just inevitable. It feels like that it's going to keep growing.
I'm gonna keep feeding off that. I'm gonna turn it back to Leaf and ask this question. I want to give you the opportunity to offer like your vision, your dream, or what you'd like to really see in the future of e-bikes and bike riding for youth.
Yeah, so awesome. Yeah, so e-bikes at my school have always been something that you see anytime you're around the school. Like in front of the school, you'll see e-bikes just in the racks on both sides of the school. But with with new signs up around the school that say that you can't ride the e-bike to school anymore, and then it has tiny text that says unless you're 16. And how my school does this is they do the same thing as if you're registering your car to be able to park in the parking lot. Since now at high school, you're allowed to drive to school, which is also a pretty big deal. And it does line up with the same age with 16 and 16. You're both able now to ride an e-bike and to ride a car or to drive a car. And I think driving a car has been the normal thing for kids to be excited about and they look forward to it. And it just kind of obscures the excitement over riding an e-bike at the same age, which I think could be a problem for kids who might have wanted to ride an e-bike before, who now are looking forward to driving cars, which just ends up with more cars on the road. And if you're over by High Desert Middle School, I'm sure you can see how bad driving around there is, but it also is the e-bikes. So my solution that I would want to see is just the ability for these people who would want to ride their e-bikes to be able to do so safely, whether that's, I don't know, limiting the classes to the age groups, or I like that idea, or just education. I think all of these will work out in some way as long as we get these people able to ride their e-bikes where they want to and when they want to. And it's just the freedom. So that's what I would want.
Thank you so much. Well, I got the chills just thinking about that. That'd be so great, right? The more people that have access to riding bikes. Well, I have so many more questions, but I do want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions to our panel. So I will move around the room with this mic, and here we go. I'm mobile. You can go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, my name is David Welton. I'm curious, like, with legal stuff, we've talked a lot about Oregon. What are the laws in our neighboring states, Washington and California, with regards to under 16?
Yeah, I wish that I had a better answer for that. And I don't have a clear understanding of that. I do think that there are states that have allowed class one. And I think that that's, so my understanding is that the way that Trenton's law left it was that they were not going to pass class one e-bikes for under 16, although that was the initial aim, but that there's going to be some work group committee work to think about how best to do that. And with that, I think being what people expect to happen here before long. So
my understanding is that actually California and Washington allow both class one and class two under 16, and say class three, which are the really fast ones, like, okay, you have to be 18 for that.
Yeah, and the way that Trenton's law was initially conceived was not to allow class two for under 16. And maybe that'll be something that'll be the subject of some discussion as they work through it.
Okay.
Only 7 states restrict e-bikes under 16 for class 1 and class 2, like you mentioned. So we're in the most restrictive of all states. Only 7 states restrict class 1 and class 2. That's not great.
I first want to thank Commute Options for this great panel. I think I would have liked to see this happen a little earlier in all of this process, because I think you guys have brought a lot of really great insights to the conversation. I mean, I've participated and been a audience member to most of the conversations we've been having in Bend since the unfortunate, tragedy happened in this town. And, I hope that you guys have been, discussing this with our lawmakers and policymakers in the state, because I think it's important that these kinds of messages make it to those individuals. And I think the sentiment tonight was really, really, great. I guess my biggest question and to you guys is, we spent a lot of time, and this has kind of been the same throughout all of the different conversations, is we're not talking about the massive several thousand-pound thing in the room, which is the vehicle, right? So Leaf, you kind of mentioned it, which is there are these kids that are making the choice, not just for themselves, but for the future that we want and we all hope for, which is micromobility, not lumbering around in a 1,000-pound vehicle, but choosing to make a smart choice for both ourselves and our freedoms and ability to get around, and also for, the climate crisis that we're dealing with. And the choice that 16-year-olds are having to make now, it's much easier to get into a car. And let me tell you, being around Caldera or Summit High School or any of these places where people can drive, you see, I am much more afraid on my cargo bike of a 16-year-old sideswiping me in their vehicle than any kid on an e-bike driving around town. So that's my biggest frustration and complaint, is we're actively restricting the right decision being made instead of, supporting them in the decision they want to make for their future. So I guess, if there's any more specific insight around, and unfortunately, there's not a whole lot. I know Ari's here, so we do have somewhat of a policymaker in the room. But just, the car, right? It's the vehicle that we're talking about the most around here, is what happens when you're in conflict with a very large object. And a helmet's not gonna help you because they're not designed for vehicle impacts. They're for you falling off of your bike, not for you getting hit by a car at 35 plus miles an hour. So just interested to hear about that.
I can just yell.
Yeah.
We're good. So, I wanted to answer this question. Well, thank you. Good seeing you. Thank you for the question. From my perspective, maybe forward looking, I think we have a huge opportunity here in Bend to develop a better off-road trail system. I think we benefit in some instances, from the city and the park district being separate agencies, but in other areas, I think we'd be more powerful together. And this is, we have this incredible system of irrigation canals, of other rights of way that are very hard to develop trails along. And I think having the two agencies come together to work stronger together, to coordinating our plans better, could go a long way. It's funny, I was talking to the director of the Tualatin Hills Park and Recreation District yesterday on the phone about a project, and he told me that it took 7 years to get the permits and they paved it in 2 days, the trail, right? And that, I can tell you, if you don't love trail planning and trail design, you won't make it, because it is the hardest thing to get. I always tell myself, if I can get 3/4 to a mile of trail a year, I've earned my paycheck. But so I think there's this huge opportunity, primarily with these irrigation canals and some of the other rights of way, for us to come together. I'm not an expert in roadway design. That's not the park district's field. I know the city's been working really hard on new designs, and it's cool what we're seeing along the Wilson corridor. But to me, ultimately, the solution is to get the people separated from the traffic as much as possible. And that's what we're really focused on as an organization.
I guess I just wanted to add on to what you were saying earlier about like the decision between cars and bikes. And then I wanted to bring up how my school specifically, we have an announcements and everything. And in the announcements, they have recently been pointing out how you shouldn't be riding an e-bike if you're under 16. This is what's bad about riding an e-bike. If this is how they're unsafe. And it's kind of giving them this bad reputation over compared to where we don't see anything about cars. And just in the last week's newsletter for my school, it was talking about how a couple students in the last couple of years had gotten hurt on their e-bikes, but there was nothing about how these massive vehicles, these cars and trucks that kids are driving, have hurt anybody. So I think that's something that we can change pretty easily, just to start making e-bikes the normal thing and to have more people make the decision.
Yeah, also, to follow up on that, I saw a great video the other day, because we're talking about a bike versus a car, the little guy versus the big guy, and the big guy is always going to win, right? So when you walk in somebody else's shoes and get that different perspective, you learn a lot. And this video that I saw was about new bus drivers, and they have every bus driver on a stationary bike that they have to ride, and then the bus comes by at 2 feet away, 1 foot away, 3 feet away, whatever, and you can just see their faces. They're absolutely terrified when that bus is legally 3 feet away, right? But we don't necessarily educate our drivers that way when we go through any kind of a driving test or anything like that. So it's great that we do the education on the e-bike side and the cyclist side, but also, for the driver of the vehicles, the cars that have a huge impact on the safety for everybody on the road. And one way to do it would be to offer up ways to educate people just specifically what does that person feel like? Maybe I'm not a bike rider at all. I just ride my car or drive my car. But now if I can be in the shoes of the person that, is riding that bike, I have a better understanding. And when I come up to that person on the bike, I'm going to swerve away from them instead of hugging the road a little bit just because I don't like cyclists, right? So that kind of education for that person would be a great way to go.
I love it. I'm gonna use this as an opportunity for a plug for Oregon Friendly Driver. I wouldn't mind us being able to put everyone on bikes while we taught it, but we do offer that now statewide, Oregon Friendly Driver, to try to give that perspective of people driving and really paint this picture of like, we should really consider them as all people, because sometimes we put them in you're a cyclist, or put them in these boxes. And so Oregon Friendly Driver does try to do that. And I've got ideas of how we can just step it up a notch. So you can check that out at OregonFriendlyDriver.org. Does anybody else have any questions? We have more time. Oh, yeah.
Thanks. I was curious about the sidewalk provision and the e-bike restriction on sidewalks, and both what maybe a question for a legal question about what constitutes a sidewalk, and then Henry, since you're a trail planner and understand intersections and off-road, off of the main road routes, what complications that might provide for riding on a path, and how that, like, how things kind of shift in terms of legal definitions, because I've always been curious about that with as a cyclist entering a roundabout and all those different pieces.
Pass this on just because the
Yeah, sure.
air came on and it.
Yeah, so I think the definition of a sidewalk in Oregon applies to a lot of places that people like to ride that when they're riding on them, don't think of as sidewalks. So one of my favorite rides in Portland is what many people would think of as a multi-use path that goes along the Columbia and the Willamette rivers. But there isn't an Oregon statutory definition for multi-use path. It's there's a bicycle path and there's a sidewalk. And the significant majority of this path, as I would refer to it, is in fact a sidewalk. And that's significant both because you can't ride an e-bike on it legally. And if you were to be involved in a crash, then people would say that you were, a trespasser effectively on that sidewalk. It's also important because when you enter and cross driveways and streets on that path, the legal duty in Oregon is to slow down to a walking speed on a conventional bike in order to maintain the right-of-way protections of a crosswalk, for example. So, yeah, I would say that portions of the Springwater corridor in Portland are sidewalks. Portions of the Kelly Point path that I'm referring to are sidewalks. And I suspect that there's similar areas here in Bend that would be sidewalks that you might not think of as a sidewalk.
Is there a definition for a bicycle path?
There is a definition for a bicycle path, and it's a path that's got markings that indicate it's to be used for bicycles. But there aren't the rules of the road that govern how to behave on bicycle paths are somewhat less clear than out on the roadway, because it's not part of the road network. And so whereas the duties of a bicyclist on a sidewalk are very specific in the statute about, you have to use an audible signal before you pass pedestrians, and you have to slow down to a walking speed at certain places. You can't ride an e-bike. And then another thing that I think is interesting is that in Portland, for example, there's a number of city code provisions that prohibit e-bike riding or any electric vehicle riding in parks. So that applies to places that people would never think that it would apply, like the waterfront path and the Springwater Corridor, which are two of the highest volume off-street corridors for cyclists. And technically, it's not legal to ride e-bikes in those areas because there's an old provision in the city code that says no electric vehicles. So I'm not sure about comparable statutes here in Bend, but because there's been such a, increase in popularity and use of e-bikes, you find some sort of outdated provisions that you hope would be updated, but haven't been.
Yeah, I can just quickly add on. I mean, it's definitely something we're aware of. But there's really nothing we can do from the design standpoint. Typically the way our trails interface with city infrastructure is that we have an agreement with the city where we will maintain a trail and then they maintain everything within the right of way, unless it's a very trail specific thing like a gate or a trail sign specifically. And there's portions of trails like Riverfront Street is gonna be a great example. We're working with the city to redesign that street. Will that be a trail or a sidewalk? Is a trail that's built in lieu of a sidewalk, a trail or a sidewalk? I don't know. It's one of those things that we don't really have a way around. And so we design to the best we can and to all the city standards and to all the standards that we can.
We may have time for, we have time for, can we do one more question? Just a little bit.
Apologies in advance if I kind of meander through this question. That's I'm just not talking loud enough, apparently. So I kind of view parks sort of as like the ODOT of pedestrian and bike transportation in Bend. Which is to say that like so many of our walking and biking facilities that are super important for getting from point A to point B in Bend is owned by parks, like the Deschutes River Trail and these other places are really important for getting someone from one place to another, like with a minimal interaction with vehicles. Is this a sort of responsibility that parks kind of is internalized? Or is it more of a secondary responsibility to maintaining the public places that these trails go through? Or are they kind of like viewed on the same level? Does that kind of make sense?
It definitely makes sense. It's a complicated question to answer. And I'm not a lawyer. I'm probably not the most qualified person to talk about this, but the way that recreation immunity laws work in the state of Oregon, and even with this limited update that we've seen to rec immunity, is that it distinguishes transportation facilities versus recreation facilities. And I think the Park District has always benefited from the fact that we are a recreation district and the primary purpose of what we're doing is for recreation. That's the official answer. The unofficial answer is that we know people are transporting on these. We are trying to intersect them to connect not just our facilities, to get people downtown, to do all these things. So there is an awareness, but it also limits our ability. There's been the city has approached us recently about doing a comprehensive wayfinding signage system, right? That would say to get from here, you can utilize this trail and this road. When we talked to some legal experts, they said, whoa, wait a second. We don't know if you can do that. You may be exposing yourself to more legal risk because of the way that the state statutes are written. So there's a lot of like little kind of nuanced things that we don't bill ourselves as a transportation agency. It's kind of an emerging thing, some of these changes to that, but we are hyper aware that our facilities are used as both, and we'll continue to plan and design our facilities for good, efficient recreation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow, awesome. That's incredible. We're kind of rounding that bin of wrapping up our panelist time here up front. And I'm hearing these common lines, of course, like maybe there might be a sort of a bias, but of the need for more education. And also that need of just trying to figure out what we want to prioritize, right? Do we want to put the car first? Do we want to put our people first? So I think there's a lot of work to be done. and a lot of opportunity too. So I really appreciate you all coming here, everybody coming here today to ask the questions, to learn, because this is part of it. Like what we're doing here is that, moving forward with some education right now, making connections. So thank you, everybody. And we have another half an hour in this space. So an opportunity to kind of have some one-on-ones with our panelists if they're gonna hang out a little longer and enjoy, unless they've taken the snacks yet, but there might be, or they're taking it to go, but, and if there's any of the panels have any final closing comments, you can take about 20 seconds, maybe 25, if you want to say any final last words. Anything? You're not, Chris.
Sure. I would just say that, it strikes me listening to, Henry, talk about, the parks, that because of how much growth there is in popularity of trying to get around on bikes and e-bikes, and fear of riding on the road with cars, it really has imposed a big additional burden on trail people to accommodate all different kinds of users. And you've got all these people sort of retreating or being attracted to trails as a nice car-free alternative, and potentially putting people on e-bikes and bikes and pedestrians in conflict in those relatively small spaces. And I just think it strikes me that that could be a surge in demand that can be challenging to deal with, that is ultimately an indication of a really great and healthy thing, which is people want to be active. But putting a burden on a particular part of the government that is sort of a recent and big and hard to deal with development. So I appreciate what you guys do.
I got it. Yeah, I really appreciate everybody that came here today. We're living all this here, and obviously you're concerned, you recognize that there needs to be some action and some change. And I hope you learned a little bit here, and then you bring that to people that you know, continue the conversation, and we just make this into a snowball effect, and we continue to change for the better in the future. Thank you.
Sure. In closing, I guess I would say, it's interesting. I think as an organization, we're very supportive of e-bikes. Me personally, I'm very supportive. I see how they can help. I think there's not enough conversation about regulating the industry and having some regulations. Cars are regulated, alcohol, cigarettes, all these things. My nephew, who's 15, wants to buy a Ciron bike that his friend modded that can go 80 miles an hour. This is the same kid that got caught on the roof of the high school 2 weeks ago throwing rocks. Like there's an industry responsibility, I think, and it's really hard because it feels like a lot of the burden has come onto the land managers and the different park districts in the cities for something that is just so beyond our control. The one wheels, the everything, it's just exploding, and I don't think that there's enough control of the industry, and that needs to be looked at a state and at a federal level.
You good? All right, well, just a reminder, everybody, that it's walk and roll challenge time, right? We've got 2 weeks of activities that have been streaming there, and there's lots of information you can find out on the e-bike education as well. There's a flyer on those tables that takes you to the class that is actually actively being updated with the new Trenton law information. You're going to see some strikeout to be updated parts of that, but check that out. That's a 5-minute education course, and we just hope we can keep developing more of that and get on the ground and help a lot more people be able to have access to that transportation option. So thank you, panelists. A big round of applause for our panelists for being here.